It was supposed to be a quiet afternoon, the kind where an elderly man should be able to sit back, enjoy the fresh air, and not have to worry about anything. But for Mr. Charles, a 72-year-old retired school teacher, the world wasn't so simple. He had lived in this neighborhood for over 40 years, watched kids grow up, seen businesses come and go, and had always been a respected member of the community. But on this particular day, none of that mattered. Not to the officers who rolled up on him like he was some kind of criminal. It started with a slow drive-by, the kind that sends a chill down your spine when you know you've done nothing wrong. Then came the flashing lights. Two cops stepped out of their patrol car, hands resting on their belts, eyes locked on Mr. Charles as if he were a threat. "Sir, what are you doing here?" one of them asked, his tone sharp, almost rehearsed. Mr. Charles, sitting on a bench outside his own apartment complex, looked up, confused. "I live here," he replied, keeping his voice calm. He'd been around long enough to know that any wrong move could turn a simple conversation into something far worse. The officers exchanged glances. One of them stepped closer. "We got a report of suspicious activity in the area. You match the description." Mr. Charles let out a short, bitter laugh. He knew exactly what that meant. He'd heard this story before, too many times. "Suspicious activity," he repeated. "I've been sitting here reading my newspaper." But the officers weren't interested in explanations. They asked for his ID, even though he had no legal obligation to provide one. You could feel the tension thickening in the air. Passers-by slowed their steps, glancing over but not daring to intervene. "I don't understand," he said, keeping his hands visible. "What exactly am I being accused of?" One officer stepped forward, his posture stiff, his presence looming. "Just cooperating will make this easier," he said. Mr. Charles had seen enough in his lifetime to recognize where this was heading. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from frustration. He had taught generations of kids about justice, respect, and dignity, yet here he was, being treated like he didn't belong in his own neighborhood. He reached into his pocket, slowly, deliberately, and pulled out his phone. The officers tensed, hands inching toward their holsters, but Mr. Charles didn't flinch. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. Instead, he made a call. One ring, two rings. Then a voice answered, calm, authoritative. Mr. Charles spoke clearly, his words careful but firm. "Hey, it's me. I need you to come down here right away." The officers exchanged glances again, but this time there was a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes. Something had shifted. Mr. Charles placed the phone back in his lap and looked up at them. "You gentlemen might want to wait a few minutes before you make any more mistakes," he said. The next few moments stretched out in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. What happened next would change everything, for Mr. Charles, for the officers, and for the people watching. And in just a few minutes, their careers would be over. Mia's hands were still shaking as she stepped outside. The cold night air hit her face, but it did nothing to clear the storm inside her. The flashing red and blue lights painted streaks of color against the pavement, and the distant hum of radio chatter filled the silence that Jake left behind. She stood frozen on the front steps, watching as the agent guided him into the unmarked car. Jake didn't fight, didn't struggle. He just sat there, staring straight ahead, as if he already knew how this would end. Mia wanted to move, wanted to say something, but what was left to say? The person she thought she knew had been lying to her all along. She should have felt betrayed, but the worst part was that a small part of her still wanted to understand why. Daniel stood beside her, his face unreadable. He had barely spoken since everything unraveled. When she finally turned to him, searching for some kind of answer, he looked at her with something close to regret. "You okay?" His voice was quiet, cautious. Mia let out a hollow laugh. "I don't even know what that means anymore." Daniel nodded, as if he understood. Maybe he did. Maybe he knew more than he was letting on. She turned back toward the car. Jake caught her gaze for just a second before looking away. The weight of that look sat heavy in her chest. She wanted to ask him if anything had ever been real, if the late-night conversations, the moments where he seemed genuine, were just part of some larger deception. But she already knew she wouldn't get an answer. The agent, the one who had spoken to her inside, approached with a measured stride. "We're taking him in for questioning," he said, his tone professional but not unkind. "If you remember anything else, anything that might help, you should call me." He handed her a card, and for a second, Mia just stared at it before taking it with numb fingers. Daniel watched the exchange carefully. "Is this over?" The agent's expression tightened slightly. "For now." Mia caught that hesitation. "But you're not sure." The agent sighed, glancing back at the car. "Jake's been involved in something bigger than what you saw tonight. This is just the beginning." Something cold settled in her stomach. Beginning of what? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied her, as if deciding how much she needed to know. "We'll be in touch," he finally said before stepping away. Mia watched as the car pulled away, disappearing down the street. The moment it was gone, the weight of everything crashed over her at once. She felt like the ground beneath her had shifted, like nothing made sense anymore. Daniel must have noticed because he said, "Come on, let's go inside." She hesitated, looking around at the quiet street, half expecting to see another shadow lurking nearby. But there was nothing. Just the distant hum of the city, the occasional flicker of a porch light in the neighboring houses. Still, she didn't feel safe. Back inside, the house felt different. The tension hadn't left. It had just changed shape. The broken table, the candles still flickering weakly, the glass shattered on the floor, it all felt like remnants of something she didn't fully understand yet. Daniel closed the door behind them, locking it out of habit. "You should sit down," he said, but Mia shook her head. "I can't," she admitted. "Not yet." Daniel hesitated before nodding. He ran a hand over his face, finally letting out a breath he had been holding for too long. "I knew something was off about him," he muttered. Mia looked at him sharply. "You knew?" "Not like that." He shook his head. I always felt like there was something he wasn't telling us." Mia swallowed hard. "Yeah, me too." And yet, she had ignored it. Brushed off the signs, told herself she was being paranoid. But deep down, she had known something wasn't right. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "You think he was using you?" The question stung, but she forced herself to face it. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe." Silence stretched between them, heavy and unspoken. Then, Mia's phone buzzed again. Her stomach clenched. Another unknown number. She hesitated before unlocking the screen. The message was short, just 3 words, but it made her blood run cold. Asterisk, asterisk, this isn't over, asterisk, asterisk. Daniel noticed her expression change. "What is it?" She turned the screen toward him. His eyes darkened as he read the words. "Who sent that?" His voice was sharper now, more alert. "I don't know," she whispered. But she had a terrible feeling that whoever it was, they weren't done with her yet. The officers didn't know what to make of it. Something about the way Mr. Charles carried himself, the confidence in his voice, the way he wasn't rattled, it unsettled them. He wasn't pleading. He wasn't panicking. He was waiting. And that was enough to make them uneasy. One officer, the younger of the two, shifted on his feet. "Who'd you just call?" he asked, trying to sound tough, but there was a slight crack in his voice. Mr. Charles just smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "You'll find out soon enough," he said, crossing one leg over the other, as if he had all the time in the world. The older officer, the one with the sharp jaw and years of experience, wasn't as easily shaken. He folded his arms. "Sir, this doesn't have to be complicated. Just show us your ID, and we'll be on our way." Mr. Charles exhaled through his nose, looking at them like he was studying a test he'd seen 100 times before. "And if I was someone else sitting here, minding my business, would you still be asking for ID?" Neither officer answered. The silence was telling. Meanwhile, A small crowd had started to gather at a distance, people pausing on their walks, some pulling out their phones. It was a scene too familiar. An older black man being questioned by police for simply existing. A few whispers passed through the group. "This is ridiculous. He's been living here for years." Same old story. The officers noticed the eyes on them now, the cameras recording. The younger one glanced at his partner. "Maybe we should." Before he could finish, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb, its engine humming like it belonged to someone important. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a tall man in a tailored suit, his face calm but serious. He moved with purpose, with authority, like someone used to making decisions that mattered. The older officer stiffened, his face twitched with recognition. The younger one looked confused. Mr. Charles smiled again. "Told you to wait," he murmured. Mr. Charles exhaled through his nose, looking at them like he was studying a test he'd seen 100 times before. "And if I was someone else sitting here, minding my business, would you still be asking for ID?" Neither officer answered. The silence was telling. Meanwhile, a small crowd had started to gather at a distance, people pausing on their walks, some pulling out their phones. It was a scene too familiar. An older black man being questioned by police for simply existing. A few whispers passed through the group. "This is ridiculous. He's been living here for years." Same old story. The officers noticed the eyes on them now, the cameras recording. The younger one glanced at his partner. "Maybe we should." Before he could finish, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb, its engine humming like it belonged to someone important. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a tall man in a tailored suit, his face calm but serious. He moved with purpose, with authority, like someone used to making decisions that mattered. The older officer stiffened, his face twitched with recognition. The younger one looked confused. Mr. Charles smiled again. "Told you to wait," he murmured. The man in the suit stepped forward, sliding a pair of dark sunglasses off his face. His eyes locked onto the officers, unblinking. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice smooth but firm. The older officer cleared his throat. "Sir, this is an active investigation." The man in the suit didn't even look at him. Instead, he turned to Mr. Charles, his entire demeanor shifting to one of respect. "Are you all right?" Mr. Charles nodded. "I'm fine now." The younger officer's confusion deepened. "Wait, who is this?" he muttered under his breath. The answer came before his partner could warn him. That would be Attorney General Marcus Davis. Someone in the crowd whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. The weight of those words dropped like a hammer. The younger officer's face paled. The older one clenched his jaw, his posture stiffening, but even he couldn't hide the flicker of worry in his eyes. This was not a man you wanted to cross. Mr. Charles leaned back, letting the moment sink in. "These officers seem to believe I don't belong here," he said, his tone light but edged with something sharper. "Maybe you can help them understand." Marcus Davis turned his gaze back to the officers, his expression unreadable. "That's so." The younger officer swallowed hard, his hand dropping from his belt. "Sir, we were just following protocol." "We?" Marcus held up a hand, cutting him off. "Let me ask you something," he said. "What was the call you received?" The officers hesitated. The older one finally spoke. "A report of suspicious activity in the area." Marcus nodded, waiting. "And what exactly did that report say?" The silence stretched. The officers had no good answer. They hadn't questioned it. They had just shown up, assumed, and acted. A man from the crowd spoke up. "Funny how this suspicious person is a man who's lived here longer than both of you have been on the force." More murmurs of agreement rippled through the people watching. The officers were losing control of the situation, and they knew it. The younger officer took a step back. "Look, this doesn't have to be a big deal. We just..." Marcus's voice cut through the air, calm but firm. "It already is." He pulled out his own phone, tapped the screen a few times, then looked at Mr. Charles. "You want to press formal charges?" The question hit like a thunderclap. The older officer's face twitched. Wait a minute. That's not necessary. We didn't. You didn't what? Marcus asked, his tone cool. Didn't assume, didn't profile, didn't intimidate a law-abiding citizen for no reason. The younger officer looked like he wanted to disappear. The older one squared his shoulders, but it was clear the confidence was slipping. The crowd was fully engaged now, phones out, recording everything. Mr. Charles let the moment hang before he finally spoke. I'll think about it. His voice was measured, steady. He looked at the officers. You two should too. Marcus gave a slow nod, then turned back to the officers. You'll both be hearing from my office. And just like that, the power shifted. The officers were no longer in control. The weight of what had just happened was settling on them. They had made a mistake, a big one, and the consequences were just beginning. Mia's breath came faster as she stared at the message on her phone. Asterisk, asterisk, this isn't over, asterisk, asterisk. The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in on her. The weight in her chest wasn't just fear anymore, it was something darker, heavier. Someone out there was still watching, still pulling the strings. Daniel leaned in, his jaw tightening as he read the text. You think it's him? Mia shook her head, but she wasn't sure. Jake was gone, locked in the back of a federal car. But the feeling creeping up her spine told her this wasn't just about him. This was bigger. The night stretched on in an eerie stillness. The street outside was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't feel natural. Mia moved toward the window, careful not to shift the blinds too much. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she scanned the street, the shadows stretching under the dim glow of a flickering street lamp. Nothing, but that didn't mean no one was there. Daniel took a step back, running a hand through his hair. We can't just wait around, he muttered. Whoever sent that message, they're playing with us. Mia turned to him, gripping her phone tighter. Then what do we do? He didn't answer right away. His mind was racing, she could tell. Finally, he said, we find out the truth before they do. Mia swallowed hard. And what if they already know more than us? Daniel met her eyes. Then we're already in trouble. A knock at the door made them both jump. It was soft, barely audible, but it was enough to send a fresh wave of adrenaline crashing through Mia's body. She and Daniel exchanged a look, one that said asterisk, asterisk, we're not expecting anyone, asterisk, asterisk. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the knock came again, a little louder this time. Mia forced herself to step forward, every nerve in her body screaming for her to stop. She peered through the peephole, her breath catching in her throat. A woman stood outside. Mid-40s, sharp eyes, dark hair pulled into a tight ponytail. She didn't look afraid. She looked like she asterisk, asterisk, belonged asterisk, asterisk there, like she had been waiting for this moment. Mia hesitated before unlocking the door, keeping the chain in place as she cracked it open. Who are you? The woman's expression didn't change. I need to talk to you. Now. Daniel stepped beside Mia, his voice firm. About what? The woman's eyes flicked to him. About Jake, and about what's coming next. Mia's fingers tightened around the doorframe. Who sent that message? The woman exhaled, like she had expected the question. That's why I'm here. To warn you. Something about her tone made Mia's stomach twist. Warn us about what? The woman's gaze darkened. You're in the middle of something you don't understand, and if you don't act fast, you won't get another chance to walk away. Daniel shot Mia a look, a silent question hanging between them. Then the woman said something that made Mia's blood run cold. You think this started with Jake, she said quietly, but he was just a small part of a much bigger game. Mia's mind spun, her grip tightening on the door. What are you talking about? The woman's expression softened just a little. He wasn't lying about everything. Mia felt the air shift. The doubt she had buried deep inside clawed its way back up. Then tell me the truth. The woman didn't hesitate. Jake was trying to protect you. And now that he's gone, there's no one left to keep them from coming for you next. A cold wave of dread washed over Mia. Daniel's voice was steady, but Mia could hear the tension beneath it. Who's coming? The woman's answer was almost a whisper. The people he was running from. Mia's stomach dropped. Jake hadn't been running from the FBI. He had been running from them, and now they were coming for her. The officers looked rattled, their confidence slipping away under the weight of the moment. But just when it seemed like they had no way out, a voice cut through the tension. Wait. Everyone turned. A woman in a navy blue blazer stepped out of the crowd. Her stride was sharp, her expression unreadable. She was holding a phone in one hand, and in the other, a badge. The older officer's face tensed. He knew who she was before she even spoke. Detective Harris, Internal Affairs, she said, flashing her credentials. I need to have a word. The younger officer's mouth parted slightly, his breath hitching. The older officer clenched his jaw, but the flicker of control he had left was crumbling fast. Mr. Charles, who had been calm this entire time, finally showed a hint of curiosity. Now, this is getting interesting, he muttered under his breath. Marcus Davis turned to Harris, his sharp eyes scanning her face. You're early, he said. I got the call before I even stepped out of my office, Harris replied, slipping her phone into her pocket. She turned her gaze to the officers, her expression unreadable. You two mind telling me why my division has been getting complaints about you for months? A ripple moved through the crowd. More people had gathered, their whispers growing louder. Months, someone murmured. The older officer tried to keep his posture straight, but there was no hiding the way his fingers twitched. I don't know what you're talking about. Harris didn't flinch. No, that's interesting, because we've got reports of multiple stops just like this one. Suspicious activity calls, always involving black men in this neighborhood. No arrests, no actual crimes, just intimidation. The younger officer was practically frozen now, his hands tightening into fists. We were doing our jobs, he mumbled. Harris' eyebrows lifted. That's funny, because your captain doesn't seem to agree. The words hit like a shockwave. Mr. Charles leaned back, watching the scene unfold. Marcus remained still, studying every expression, every shift in body language. The crowd was fully engaged now, people whispering, recording, shaking their heads. The older officer took a slow breath. Detective Harris, I don't know what you think you've got, but... You can save it, she interrupted. You're both officially relieved of duty, effective immediately. You'll be turning in your badges and weapons today. The younger officer sucked in a breath. Wait, what? The older one's face turned red. This is ridiculous, he snapped. Over what? Some guy sitting on a bench. Marcus finally stepped forward. No, he said, voice calm but final. Over a pattern of harassment, of abuse, of ignoring the very laws you swore to uphold. He nodded toward Mr. Charles. And today, you just happened to pick the wrong man. The crowd erupted, some clapping, others shaking their heads in disbelief. A few neighbors stepped forward, telling stories of their own. How they had been stopped, questioned, made to feel like outsiders in their own homes. Harris pulled out her phone again. You're going to want to call your union reps, she told the officers, because this isn't going away. The younger officer looked like he was about to be sick. The older one, though, wasn't finished. He turned to Marcus, his voice low. You think this is over? Marcus tilted his head slightly. I think it's just beginning. And just like that, the balance of power had shifted again. The officers had walked into this situation believing they had control. Now, they were the ones under the spotlight, their careers hanging by a thread. But if the look in the older officer's eyes was any indication, he wasn't going down without a fight. Mia's heart pounded as the woman's words sank in. The people Jake had been running from, they weren't just after him. They were after her. She felt the weight of it settle deep in her chest, a suffocating pressure that made it hard to breathe. Daniel stepped forward, his voice controlled but firm. Who are they? The woman hesitated, her sharp eyes scanning the street behind her before she finally spoke. People who don't like loose ends. Jake was one. Now you are two. Mia's grip on the doorframe tightened. Why me? The woman exhaled, glancing at Mia's phone. Because you know more than you think. And now they know that too. A cold shiver ran down Mia's spine. The message, it wasn't a warning, it was a promise. A sudden noise from the alley made all three of them freeze. A sharp crack, like a footstep on gravel. Mia's breath caught in her throat as she turned toward the sound. Daniel reacted first, reaching for the nearest lamp and switching it off. The room plunged into darkness, shadows stretching against the walls. Get away from the door, the woman ordered in a low whisper. Mia hesitated, but something in the woman's tone made her obey. A long silence followed. Nothing but the faint hum of the city in the distance. Then, another sound. The unmistakable click of a lock being tested. Mia's stomach twisted. Someone was outside. Daniel moved fast, crossing the room and grabbing something from the drawer, a heavy flashlight. Not much, but better than nothing. The woman reached into her jacket, her expression unreadable. Then, the front doorknob turned ***. Mia's breath hitched. For a terrifying second, the door held. Then, with a slow creak, it began to open. Daniel lunged, slamming it shut before flipping the lock again. The woman moved to the window, peering outside. Her jaw clenched. They're here, she murmured. Mia's pulse hammered. Who? The woman didn't answer. Instead, she turned to Daniel. Back door, now. Mia's legs felt frozen, but Daniel grabbed her wrist, pulling her toward the kitchen. The woman followed close behind, her hands steady on something beneath her jacket. The second they reached the back door, the first loud ***bang** rattled the front of the house. Someone was trying to force their way in. Mia's breathing turned shallow. This wasn't just a warning anymore. They weren't waiting. Daniel yanked the back door open, but the woman stopped them just before they stepped outside. She peered into the night, scanning the backyard before giving a sharp nod. Go, now. Mia didn't hesitate this time. She stepped out, her feet crunching on the damp grass as Daniel kept close. The woman shut the door behind them, leaving it unlocked. At ***trap***, they moved fast, slipping through the shadows toward the narrow alley behind the house. Mia's mind raced, her thoughts tumbling over each other. Who were these people? How had they found her so fast? And Jake. Was he still alive? Or had they already gotten to him too? A sharp sound, footsteps. Close. Mia turned, but Daniel pulled her forward, keeping her moving. They reached the alley's edge, where an old car sat waiting. The woman tossed Daniel the keys. Drive. He didn't argue. The second they were inside, the woman slid into the back seat, watching the house. They'll realize we're gone in less than a minute, she muttered. Daniel started the engine. Mia turned toward the woman. Where are we going? The woman's gaze flickered to her. Somewhere they won't find you. Mia's fingers tightened into fists. Not good enough. I want answers. The woman studied her for a moment before nodding. Then hold on, because you're about to get them. Daniel hit the gas. The tires screeched as they pulled away, disappearing into the night. But Mia couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how fast they ran, the truth was already catching up to them. The tension in the air was still thick, but the power dynamic had completely shifted. Just moments ago, Mr. Charles had been the one being questioned, the one being treated like he didn't belong. Now, the officers stood there, the weight of their actions finally catching up to them. The older officer's jaw was tight, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He wasn't used to being on this end of things. His whole career, he had been the one in control, the one giving orders. But now, with the Attorney General staring him down and an internal affairs detective making calls, he had nothing left to hold onto. The younger officer, on the other hand, looked completely lost. His eyes darted between his partner, Detective Harris, and Marcus Davis. It was sinking in now. This wasn't going to blow over. There would be no quiet reassignment, no simple slap on the wrist. Their time on the force was coming to an end, and there was nothing they could do about it. "I suggest you go home," Harris finally said, breaking the silence. "You'll be receiving official notice about the investigation within the next 24 hours. I'd advise you to start thinking about your next steps." The older officer exhaled sharply through his nose, his pride keeping him from saying anything more. Instead, he gave Mr. Charles one last look, as if trying to memorize his face. Maybe he was thinking about all the times he had done this before, stopped someone for no reason, flexed his authority just because he could. But this time was different. This time he had lost. Without another word, he turned on his heel and walked toward the patrol car. The younger officer hesitated for a second before following. The car doors slammed shut, and just like that, they were gone. A slow wave of relief moved through the crowd. Some people shook their heads in disbelief, others murmured to each other, still processing everything that had just happened. But for Mr. Charles, there was no celebration, no smug satisfaction, just a deep breath, a weight lifting off his shoulders. Marcus turned to him. "You all right?" Mr. Charles nodded, his expression calm. "I've been all right," he said. "Just tired of this same old story." Marcus studied him for a moment before offering a small nod of understanding. At least this time, it didn't end the way it usually does. That was the truth, and they both knew it. Detective Harris checked her phone before slipping it back into her blazer. "Mr. Charles, if you decide you want to move forward with a formal complaint, my office will handle everything." Mr. Charles gave a small chuckle. "I appreciate it, Detective, but I've been fighting battles longer than you've probably been alive. Right now, I think I just want to finish reading my newspaper." That got a few chuckles from the people nearby. Even Harris cracked a small smile. But Marcus wasn't quite done. He turned to the crowd, his voice carrying just enough weight to get their attention. "Let this be a reminder," he said. "Silence only helps the ones who abuse their power. If something doesn't feel right, speak up. Record. Report. Make noise. This could have ended differently, and we all know that." A few heads nodded in agreement. Some people muttered quiet thank yous to Mr. Charles before slowly dispersing, heading back to their afternoons. Marcus turned back to Mr. Charles. "Need a ride somewhere?" Mr. Charles shook his head. "Nah, I'm good. Just going to sit here a little longer." Marcus gave him a knowing look. "You sure?" Mr. Charles chuckled. "Son, I was sitting here before they showed up, and I'll be sitting here long after they're gone." Marcus smiled at that, gave a respectful nod, and stepped back toward his car. Harris followed suit, making a few final notes in her phone before walking away. And just like that, the street slowly returned to normal. The sun hung lower in the sky now, casting warm golden light over the bench where Mr. Charles sat. He unfolded his newspaper, smoothing out the pages, and settled back into his seat. It was a familiar rhythm, something he had done 1,000 times before. But today, there was something different in the air. Today, he hadn't just been another name in a long list of people treated unfairly. Today, the ones who thought they had all the power had been forced to answer for their actions. And as he sat there, turning the pages, he knew that even though the fight was far from over, this moment, this small but significant moment, had mattered.